The constable's face took on the peculiar mottled appearance of a man who has just realized he has failed to observe something rather fundamental. He consulted his notebook with the desperate urgency of one hoping to find redemption in hastily scrawled observations, and Whimsy, watching this performance with the patient amusement of a man accustomed to witnessing the human intellect engaged in its more laborious efforts, settled himself into a wing-backed chair with the air of someone prepared to wait indefinitely. It was Dr. Reeves who, after a moment's uncomfortable silence, ventured an explanation. The hat, he believed, had been mentioned by the valet as belonging to the deceased's guest, a Mr. James Carrington, a business associate from London, who had arrived the previous evening and had apparently departed rather hurriedly that morning without collecting his personal effects. This intelligence caused Whimsy's eyebrows to achieve a height previously unrecorded in the annals of his facial expressions, and he proceeded to inquire with a civility that somehow managed to convey profound skepticism whether anyone had thought to interview this Mr. Carrington regarding his movements, his departure, or indeed his relationship with the now deceased Mr. Ashford. The silence that followed this query possessed a quality almost palpable in its weight, and Whimsy smiled the smile of a man who has posed a question to which the answer is no. Nobody had, and furthermore, nobody had thought to wonder whether they should have done. Mr. Ashford Sr., the brother, cleared his throat with an agitated sound not unlike a man attempting to dislodge something from his trachea. He explained, with the stuttering reluctance of one admitting to oversight, that Mr. Carrington had left before dawn, taking the early train to London. The valet had mentioned it in passing, though naturally everyone had assumed he would return once the matter of dear Marcus's demise had been clarified. Whimsy set down the rain hat upon the side table with the gentleness of an antiquarian returning a first edition to its shelf, and observed, with that particular inflection that transformed simple statements into indictments, that it seemed rather curious that a man in possession of sufficient social breeding to leave behind personal property should neglect to take his leave of his host or to collect his hat, which, from all appearances, had been exposed to considerable weather, and was therefore presumably rather valuable to him. Moreover, continued Whimsy, moving toward the study, with the purposeful drift of a man drawn by magnetic force, one did wonder whether anyone had examined the study itself in any detail, beyond the obvious theatrical arrangement of the teacup and its sinister contents. He paused at the threshold, his hand resting upon the doorframe, and turned back to inquire, almost as an afterthought, whether the study door had been locked from the inside or the outside when the valet had discovered it that morning. Constable Matthews consulted his notes again, his face assuming the particular shade of crimson associated with acute professional embarrassment, and admitted that actually, upon reflection, he believed the door had been unlocked, and furthermore, he was not entirely certain whether anyone had actually ascertained that the key was in the lock at all, as opposed to having been removed and reinserted from the outside at some point subsequent to the discovery. This revelation produced a quality of silence in the drawing-room not entirely different from that produced by a dropped tray in a cathedral. Whimsy, however, seemed to find nothing surprising in this confirmation of investigative incompetence, and merely remarked that it seemed, upon the whole, rather fortunate that he had abandoned his brandy, as the puzzle at hand appeared to possess a complexity that would otherwise have rendered the evening's examination somewhat tedious. He proceeded into the study with the careful movements of a man entering sacred precincts, his eyes moving systematically across the room's furnishings, the heavy desk with its carefully arranged papers, the leather chairs positioned at strategic intervals, the bookcase lining the far wall with its collection of volumes suggesting a man of conventional taste and limited intellectual ambition. The tea service occupied the side table near the desk, the poisoned cup precisely positioned as though composed for a still-life painting, and Whimsy noted with interest that the teapot contained still warm liquid and a second cup, unused, positioned nearby with mathematical precision. He turned to address the room at large, his voice carrying that particular tone of gentle instruction reserved for teaching particularly slow children, and inquired whether anyone had yet determined who had served the tea, at what time it had been served, and most crucially, whether anyone had actually witnessed the deceased consuming any portion of it whatsoever. The collection of uncomfortable glances that followed this query suggested an affirmative answer to the first question and negative answers to all subsequent inquiries, which Whimsy received with a soft exhalation that might have been a sigh or might have been laughter, though his face remained arranged in an expression of neutral interest. He requested, with a courtesy that somehow managed to convey considerable authority, that someone retrieve Mr. Frederick Hartley, the valet, as he found himself possessed of several questions regarding the service of breakfast that morning, and moreover, He wished to know what this Frederick Hartley could tell him regarding the precise relationship between the deceased and his overnight guest, particularly whether any raised voices, unusual activity, or behavior contrary to Mr. Ashford's customary morning routine had been observed during the hours between Mr. Carrington's arrival and his apparently surreptitious departure before dawn. Frederick Hartley materialized in the study doorway with the sudden solidity of a man who had been hovering just beyond it for some considerable time, which suggested that the servants' network at Ashford Hall operated with the efficiency of a telegraph service and considerably greater fidelity to accuracy. He was a man of perhaps 60 years, with the peculiar physical compression of those who have spent a lifetime maintaining the posture of deference, his face arranged in an expression of professional neutrality so complete that it suggested the absence of any internal emotional life whatsoever. Whimsy gestured him toward a chair with the casual authority of one accustomed to command, and began not with inquiry but with observation, remarking that it must have been rather tiresome for Mr. Hartley to have had the household disrupted by the arrival of a guest the previous evening, and moreover to have had his morning routine interrupted by the considerably more dramatic disruption occasioned by the discovery of his employer deceased. The valet's silence in response to this observation was itself informative, and Whimsy continued with the smooth progress of a man reading from a script he had composed beforehand. He noted that the tea service suggested breakfast had been prepared with considerable care, the service for 2 cups indicating either that the deceased had anticipated company or that Mr. Hartley had made an assumption regarding requirements. He wondered aloud whether Mr. Carrington had taken breakfast in the study that morning, whether he had joined Mr. Ashford for a meal, or whether the 2nd cup represented merely the valet's customary precaution in laying a table. Hartley's response, when it came, emerged in a voice like the creaking of ancient hinges, carefully measured and entirely devoid of inflection. Mr. Carrington, he explained, had declined breakfast, citing an early engagement in London that necessitated his departure before 7 o'clock. He had taken tea in his room, served by the parlour maid, and had requested that his motor car be brought round at 6:30 to convey him to the station. As for Mr. Ashford, the valet continued, maintaining his studied neutrality, the master had requested tea to be brought to the study at 8 o'clock precisely, as had been his custom these many years past. Whimsy received this information with the expression of a man who has heard something that confirms a suspicion rather than contradicts it, and proceeded to inquire whether the valet had himself carried the tea to the study, or whether this task had been delegated to a member of the junior staff. The hesitation that preceded Hartley's response was minute but unmistakable, a fractional pause that suggested the valet was calculating whether the truth or a convenient fiction would better serve his purposes. He confessed, finally, that the parlour maid, a young woman named Sarah Thorne, had brought the tea, as the valet had been occupied with other matters relating to Mr. Carrington's preparations for departure. This intelligence caused Whimsy to request that Miss Sarah Thorne be located with considerable urgency, as he found himself possessed of the growing conviction that the young woman in question might possess observations of considerable importance to the resolution of the morning's unfortunate events. Hartley withdrew with a measured step that suggested either perfect composure or the careful maintenance of a facade thereof, and Whimsy turned his attention to the desk itself, examining with minute attention the arrangement of papers that lay upon its surface. They were, he observed to Constable Matthews, who had trailed him with the devotion of a dog uncertain whether it might be about to be either praised or kicked, of considerable interest in their very mundanity. Here were correspondence regarding dividend payments, household accounts of the most prosaic nature, and a ledger suggesting Mr. Ashford had maintained detailed records of his financial transactions. Yet one item arrested his attention with particular force: a telegram, dated the previous day, bearing a London postmark and bearing the cryptic message, "Business concluded satisfactorily. Arrangement finalized. Arriving this evening with documentation." JC, the initials required no decryption, and Whimsy held the telegram toward the light, his eyes narrowing as he observed that it had been torn somewhat violently from its envelope, the edges ragged and irregular in a manner suggesting haste or agitation in its receipt. The valet's reappearance, accompanied by a young woman of perhaps 25, with the complexion of one who has spent considerable time in service and the eyes of someone who had witnessed considerably more than her station suggested she ought to have observed, drew Whimsy's attention from this document. Sarah Thorne curtsied with automatic precision and waited with the patient immobility of those trained to remain unobtrusive in the presence of their betters. Whimsy addressed her with the courteous formality that suggested to the young woman that she was being treated not as a servant, but as a witness of potential significance, and inquired whether she had brought the tea to the study that morning, and whether, in the hours of her service, she had observed anything unusual in Mr. Ashford's demeanor or in the arrangement of the study itself. The girl's response tumbled forth in a rush of nervous words, her carefully maintained composure crumbling beneath the weight of being directly addressed by a gentleman of apparent authority. She had brought the tea at 8 o'clock as instructed, she explained, and Mr. Ashford had been seated at his desk, his face rather pale, she thought, and his hands trembling slightly as he had gestured her away. She had noticed that the door to the study had been only partially closed, and she had heard voices raised in argument from within the study just moments before, though she could not determine the content of the conversation. Most significantly, and here the girl's voice dropped to a whisper, despite the fact that only Whimsy and the constable were attending to her words, she had observed Mr. Carrington descending the main staircase not 5 minutes before she herself had carried the tea, and he had been moving with considerable speed, his expression darkened by what she could only describe as rage or profound disturbance, and he had been carrying the rain hat, which he had thrust into his motor car with sufficient violence that she had thought he might tear it asunder. Whimsy received this revelation with a thoughtfulness that suggested the pieces of an intricate puzzle were beginning, in his mind, to arrange themselves into a coherent pattern, though he betrayed nothing of this nascent comprehension to his audience. He thanked Miss Thorne with a gentleness that caused the girl to blush with the intensity of one unaccustomed to courtesy from her social superiors, and dismissed her with instructions to speak to no one regarding the substance of their conversation, a directive she acknowledged with a fervent nod that suggested she had absorbed the gravity of the situation with considerable completeness. Once she had withdrawn, Whimsy turned to address the assembled company with the air of a man who has arrived at certain preliminary conclusions, though he couched his observations in the language of inquiry rather than assertion. He observed that it appeared the deceased had entertained a visitor at some point during the evening hours, a visitor with whom he had engaged in an altercation of sufficient intensity to be overheard by household staff, and that this same visitor had apparently departed the premises in a state of considerable emotional disturbance. Moreover, he continued, the arrangement of the death scene suggested a staging of remarkable theatricality, the poisoned tea positioned with almost formal precision, the study locked, and the body arranged in a fashion that implied a leisurely consumption of the fatal draught, rather than the desperate act one might expect from a man driven to self-destruction by whatever business arrangement had occasioned Mr. Carrington's arrival. He wondered aloud whether it had occurred to anyone present that the most obvious conclusion might be precisely the wrong one, and that the rain hat, abandoned in its accusatory fashion upon the study chair, might represent not the oversight of a suicidal gentleman, but rather a deliberate article left behind by someone considerably less scrupulous in their regard for the niceties of criminal concealment. Constable Matthews, whose face had assumed the appearance of a man watching a conjuring trick he was not equipped to comprehend, ventured the hesitant suggestion that perhaps Mr. Carrington ought to be located and questioned regarding his movements, a proposal that Whimsy received with an approving nod that suggested the constable had finally begun to engage his intellectual faculties in earnest. He instructed the young officer to telegraph to Scotland Yard with a description of Mr. James Carrington, detailing that the man had departed Ashford Hall at approximately 6:30 that morning by motor car bound for the railway station, and that it would be of considerable interest to determine whether said gentleman had actually boarded the early train to London, or whether he had instead employed his motor transportation to convey him to some alternative destination of greater personal utility. As for himself, Whimsy explained, he found himself possessed of certain curiosities regarding the precise nature of the business arrangement that had necessitated Mr. Carrington's nocturnal visit, and he requested that he be allowed access to Mr. Ashford's correspondence and business records, as they might illuminate the matter considerably. Mr. Ashford Sr., the brother, appeared to struggle with this proposal, his florid countenance deepening to a shade approaching apoplexy, though he was ultimately prevailed upon to grant permission through the gentle but inexorable authority that Whimsy wielded in such matters. Within the hour, Whimsy had established himself at the study desk with a pot of excellent coffee, having rejected the household tea with a commentary on its probable origins that caused the servants to exchange nervous glances, and had begun the painstaking work of examining the deceased's financial affairs with the concentration of an accountant and the intuition of a man practiced in the detection of deception. What emerged from this examination was a portrait of a man engaged in a considerably more complex financial arrangement than his placid exterior might have suggested. The ledgers revealed extensive investments in shipping ventures, several of which had produced returns of doubtful legitimacy, and correspondence indicated that Mr. Ashford had been approached some months previously by an investment syndicate promising extraordinary returns on capital invested in certain commercial enterprises of an ambiguous nature. The documents themselves were couched in language sufficiently opaque that their true meaning remained obscure. Yet the pattern was clear to one possessed of Whimsy's experience. Someone had been attempting to involve the deceased in financial arrangements that bordered upon the fraudulent. Mr. James Carrington's name appeared repeatedly in the correspondence, identified as the representative of this syndicate, and the tone of his communications shifted progressively from honeyed persuasion to something considerably more menacing, culminating in a letter dated merely 3 weeks prior, in which Carrington hinted, with barely concealed hostility, that Mr. Ashford's participation in the scheme was no longer optional, that certain parties had invested considerable resources on the basis of his cooperation, and that disappointing these parties would result in consequences considerably more severe than mere financial loss. This document Whimsy held aloft toward the lamplight, his expression reflecting a quiet satisfaction, and he remarked to Constable Matthews, who had positioned himself at an approximation of attention nearby, that it appeared the relationship between Mr. Ashford and his overnight guest had been considerably more complicated than a simple business meeting between cordial associates. Indeed, he suggested, it appeared rather more likely that Mr. Ashford had received his unwelcome visitor not as a friend but as a threat, that an altercation of genuine ferocity had ensued, and that the poisoned tea represented not an act of self-termination but rather the culmination of a considerably more deliberate crime, staged with sufficient theatrical precision to suggest that the perpetrator had been possessed of both considerable nerve and unconsiderable contempt for the intelligence of those who might investigate the matter. The telegram that Whimsy had discovered upon the study desk took on a new significance in light of this interpretation, and he proceeded to examine it with renewed attention, holding it toward the lamp with the precision of a man reading ancient script. The message business concluded satisfactorily, arrangement finalized. Arriving this evening with documentation now seemed considerably less a note of benign commercial conclusion and considerably more a threat disguised in the language of professional courtesy, particularly when one considered that the telegram had been torn from its envelope with evident violence and cast upon the desk with what appeared to be considerable agitation. Whimsy theorized aloud that Mr. Ashford, upon receiving this communication, would have understood perfectly well what it signified, that Mr. Carrington was coming to collect either his cooperation or his blood, that the documentation referenced was likely evidence of financial wrongdoing that could be employed as leverage, and that the evening visit would be characterized by considerably more than polite discussion of dividends and returns. Yet the question that arrested Whimsy's attention, the question that transformed the puzzle from one of apparent obviousness into something considerably more subtle, was why Mr. Ashford had not simply refused to see his guest, why he had not summoned the local constabulary, why he had, instead, allowed himself to be positioned in circumstances so entirely vulnerable to attack. The answer, Whimsy suggested to the increasingly bewildered constable, likely lay in the nature of the arrangement itself, and in whatever secret Mr. Ashford had been at such pains to conceal that he would prefer death to its revelation. This hypothesis prompted Whimsy to redirect his investigative attention toward the broader family circumstances, and he summoned Miss Catherine Ashford to the study with a courtesy that masked what was essentially a command. The young woman appeared within minutes, her pale composure now supplemented by an undercurrent of anxiety that manifested itself in the slight tremor of her hands as she settled herself into the chair Whimsy offered. He addressed her with a gentle courtesy reserved for persons of genuine delicacy, expressing his condolences upon the death of her father and proceeding to inquire, with a circumlocution that suggested he was approaching a sensitive subject with appropriate tact, whether her father's financial circumstances had been as robust as one might have assumed from the external evidence of his estate and property. The girl's response was not immediate, and Whimsy perceived in her hesitation the presence of knowledge that she had been trained to conceal, a family secret of sufficient magnitude that she had internalized its confidentiality as a matter of personal honor. He pressed gently, suggesting that any information she might provide could prove instrumental in clarifying the circumstances of her father's death, and that whatever secrets her father had harbored were unlikely to be advanced by her continued silence. Catherine Ashford regarded him with the intensity of a young woman weighing loyalty against pragmatism, and she finally spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, confessing that her father's financial position had been considerably less secure than the family's public facade suggested, that there had been considerable losses in recent years, and that she had overheard conversations between her father and various financial advisors in which considerable anxiety had been expressed regarding certain investments of a speculative nature. Most significantly, she revealed, her father had been desperately concerned regarding the possibility that his name might be publicly associated with certain financial ventures that had proven to be fraudulent, that such association would destroy not merely his financial reputation but his social standing, and that he had been attempting to extricate himself from these arrangements through various means, though without success. The arrival of a telegraph from Scotland Yard interrupted this conversation with news that proved simultaneously enlightening and perplexing. Mr. James Carrington had not, in fact, boarded the early train to London. Indeed, Scotland Yard's inquiries at the railway station had produced no evidence that any gentleman matching his description had purchased a ticket or been observed upon the premises that morning. More intriguingly still, Scotland Yard possessed a file on one James Carrington, a man whose true name appeared to be James Caldwell, a confidence man and suspected perpetrator of several elaborate financial frauds across the continent. A man whose methods invariably involved the identification of wealthy but financially vulnerable individuals, the establishment of fraudulent investment schemes, and the subsequent extraction of their capital through a combination of persuasion and, when persuasion proved insufficient, systematic blackmail. The telegraph suggested that Caldwell's current whereabouts were unknown, though he was believed to have departed England approximately 48 hours previously by motorcar bound for the coast. Whimsy received this intelligence with an expression suggesting that a final piece of a complex puzzle had clicked into place, and he turned to Constable Matthews with a certainty that seemed to emanate from some internal source of knowledge inaccessible to more ordinary individuals. He declared that, while it appeared almost certain that James Caldwell had indeed departed Ashford Hall in considerable haste that morning, it seemed equally apparent that he had not departed in the fashion one might expect from a man who had just committed murder. Instead, Whimsy suggested, Caldwell's rapid flight appeared to be occasioned by something considerably more immediate and considerably more personally threatening than the mere act of poisoning a cooperative victim. The rain hat, carelessly abandoned in the study, now represented not evidence of Caldwell's presence, but rather evidence of his panic, of a man fleeing from some consequence he had not anticipated. And Wimsey found himself possessed of the growing conviction that the death of Marcus Ashford, while undoubtedly murder, was precisely the wrong sort of murder to lay at Mr. James Caldwell's feet. The hypothesis that had taken root in Wimsey's consciousness required verification through methodical examination of the one element that had thus far received insufficient attention: the precise manner in which the poison had been administered and the timing of its consumption. He requested that Dr. Reeves return to the study and provide a considerably more detailed account of his findings regarding the state of the deceased's body and the contents of the teacup, inquiring specifically regarding the temperature of the liquid when discovered, the degree of decomposition evident in the corpse, and any other physical particulars that might illuminate the precise hour at which death had occurred. Dr. Reeves, a man of methodical if unimaginative temperament, produced his notes and confirmed that the tea had been lukewarm at the time of discovery, suggesting it had been consumed some hours prior to the body's discovery, and that the physical evidence suggested death had likely occurred between the hours of 8 and 9 o'clock that morning, a time frame consistent with the valet's stat. He meant regarding when the tea had been brought to the study, yet Wimsey persisted with his inquiries, requesting that the doctor confirm whether the deceased had displayed any signs of struggle, whether his fingernails bore evidence of defensive wounds, and whether the arrangement of his body at the desk suggested he had remained conscious during the onset of the poison's effects, or whether he had been rendered unconscious almost instantaneously. The doctor's responses were uniformly negative regarding evidence of struggle, and he confirmed that the physical arrangement of the body suggested the deceased had remained seated throughout, his hand still resting upon the desk in a position suggesting the onset of unconsciousness had been remarkably swift. This intelligence caused Wimsey to inquire whether such swift onset was consistent with the cyanide poisoning that had been identified in the teacup, a question that produced from Dr. Reeves the admission that the speed of onset did seem somewhat accelerated for typical cyanide poisoning, that the poison must have been in considerable concentration, and that the victim appeared to have consumed the entire cup's contents in rapid succession rather than sipping cautiously. This observation prompted Wimsey to request that the teacup itself be examined with considerably greater precision, and he dispatched Constable Matthews to secure the services of a chemist from Brighton, capable of analyzing not merely the liquid remaining in the pot, but also any residual traces within the cup itself. The young officer departed with the enthusiasm of one who had finally been assigned a task he understood, and Wimsey turned his attention to the study's physical arrangement with renewed focus, examining the desk, the chairs, and the windows with the meticulous attention of a man searching for evidence of some alteration to the room's configu. Ration. He observed to Miss Catherine Ashford, who remained in the study despite the propriety of her withdrawal, that it struck him as curious that the study window remained latched from the interior, despite the fact that the room was located on the ground floor and would provide a convenient means of entry for someone possessed of determination and sufficient agility. He inquired whether her father habitually kept the window secured in such fashion, and whether he recalled the window's condition being remarked upon by anyone during the morning's disturbance. Catherine's response was hesitant, but she confessed that the window had been mentioned by Frederick Hartley when he had discovered the body, the valet noting that the study had been precisely as it ought to be, the window secured, the door locked from within, and the overall appearance suggesting that her father had indeed taken his own life in a moment of desperate despondency. Yet Wimsey's expression suggested that this theatrical arrangement of apparent suicide possessed a quality of excessive perfection, a staging so complete and so convincing that it seemed almost to protest its own authenticity. He proceeded to the window and examined its fastenings with minute attention, observing that while the latch was indeed secured, it bore marks suggesting it had been recently manipulated. that the paint around its frame showed minute scratches consistent with leverage being applied with some force, and that the interior sill possessed a thin layer of dust, interrupted by marks suggesting something had been placed upon it and subsequently removed. The accumulation of these observations seemed to coalesce in Whimsy's mind into some coherent whole, and he turned to face the assembled company with an expression of quiet certainty that suggested he had penetrated the mystery's superficial layers and glimpsed the structure beneath. He declared that while it appeared almost certain that James Caldwell had been present in the study during the morning hours and had indeed engaged in an altercation with the deceased, the physical evidence suggested that Caldwell had not himself administered the poison. Instead, Whimsy theorized, the poisoned tea had been prepared and consumed prior to Caldwell's arrival, or, more likely, Caldwell had arrived to discover his victim already deceased, a discovery that had precipitated the panic evident in his hurried departure and his abandonment of the rain hat. The question that therefore demanded resolution was not who had poisoned Marcus Ashford, but rather who possessed both the motive and the opportunity to administer the poison in a fashion so carefully arranged as to suggest suicide, and who had subsequently contrived to maintain that appearance despite the complications occasioned by Caldwell's unexpected presence in the household. Whimsy's gaze shifted deliberately toward the study door, where Frederick Hartley stood maintaining his customary immobility, and he observed with perfect courtesy that he believed the moment had arrived to examine considerably more carefully the precise movements and activities of certain household staff during the early morning hours, and moreover to investigate whether certain individuals possessed knowledge regarding their employer's circumstances that might have motivated them toward rather more decisive action than passive observation would suggest. The valet's composure underwent a transformation so subtle that only an observer possessed of Whimsy's practiced eye might have detected it. A minute alteration in the set of his shoulders and the arrangement of his features that suggested the foundation upon which his carefully constructed facade had been built was beginning to shift beneath him. Whimsy approached the man with the casual movement of someone engaging in mere conversation, his tone carrying no accusation, merely the friendly inquiry of a gentleman interested in understanding the domestic arrangements of his temporary host. He observed that Frederick Hartley had served in the Ashford household for a considerable number of years, according to the household records Whimsy had examined, and that such lengthy service generally suggested either remarkable loyalty or remarkable circumstance that had bound servant to master in ways that transcended ordinary employment. He wondered aloud whether Mr. Hartley might have possessed knowledge regarding Mr. Ashford's financial difficulties, knowledge that would have been unavoidable for someone in his position, constantly attending to his employer's correspondence, overhearing telephone conversations, and observing the subtle alterations in household routine that inevitably accompanied financial distress. The valet's silence in response to this inquiry was itself eloquent, and Whimsy continued with the smooth progression of a man reading from a narrative he had already composed. He suggested that a devoted servant, observing his employer's progressive decline into despair occasioned by financial ruin and the threat of public humiliation, might well have conceived the idea that removal of the source of that distress would constitute an act of mercy rather than an act of transgression. Moreover, such a servant might have noted that Mr. Ashford had received communications indicating an impending visit from a man known to be violent and predatory, a man whose presence in the household would only accelerate the descent into catastrophe. In such circumstances, Whimsy mused, it would require little moral contortion to conclude that the administration of a swift and painless poison might represent the most merciful solution to an impossible situation, particularly if that solution could be arranged to appear as the voluntary act of a man driven to desperation by his own circumstances. Frederick Hartley's response, when it came, emerged in a voice drained of all pretense to emotional neutrality, the words tumbling forth in a confession that seemed to have been waiting for years to escape the confines of his carefully maintained silence. He confessed that he had indeed known of Mr. Ashford's financial troubles, had been privy to conversations regarding the fraudulent schemes into which he had been drawn, and had observed with growing horror the manner in which the blackmailers had progressively increased their pressure upon his employer. He admitted that when the telegram had arrived the previous day, he had recognized it for what it was: a final ultimatum, a demand that Mr. Ashford either submit completely to the scheme or face public exposure and ruin. That evening, Hartley continued, he had overheard the confrontation between Mr. Ashford and Mr. Carrington, had heard the threats and the desperation in his employer's voice, and had determined in that moment that he would not permit the man who had shown him kindness during 40 years of service to be destroyed by such parasites. He had therefore obtained a quantity of cyanide from the chemistry student who lodged in the village and who had previously sold him rat poison for the household, and he had added it to the tea he had prepared for his master that morning, dissolving it thoroughly, so that it would be undetectable in flavor. He had then instructed the parlour-maid to bring the tea to the study at the appointed hour, knowing that by the time she delivered it, Mr. Ashford would have made his final peace with whatever God he believed in. Hartley's confession was interrupted by his own weeping, a sight so profoundly disturbing in a man of his stolid demeanor that it seemed to puncture the composure of everyone present in the study. Yet Whimsy's expression throughout this recitation remained thoughtful rather than triumphant, and when the valet had completed his statement, Whimsy proceeded to pose a series of questions that seemed to concern themselves with minute details rather than with the confession itself. He inquired whether Hartley had been present in the study when the tea was delivered, whether he had observed Mr. Ashford consuming the poisoned liquid, and whether he had noted the precise moment at which his employer had lost consciousness. The valet's responses were negative regarding the first and third inquiries, and hesitant regarding the second, and Whimsy's expression suggested that these responses had confirmed rather than contradicted some hypothesis he had been entertaining. He then requested that Hartley recount with exactitude the precise sequence of events on the morning of the death, from the moment of Mr. Carrington's arrival at the study door through to the valet's discovery of the body. The recitation that followed revealed a timeline that seemed to contain certain peculiarities, certain gaps and inconsistencies that suggested Hartley's narrative was not entirely consistent with the physical evidence. Most significantly, Hartley described having prepared the tea and given it to the parlour-maid at 7:45, yet Dr. Reeves had indicated that death appeared to have occurred between 8 and 9 o'clock, a gap of time that seemed excessive for a poison of such potency. Moreover, Hartley's description of Mr. Carrington's arrival and his subsequent altercation with the deceased suggested that this confrontation had occurred after the poisoned tea had been consumed, yet the valet had not mentioned hearing any sounds of struggle or disturbance during the period when the poison ought to have been taking effect. Whimsy's gaze shifted from the valet to the assembled company, and he observed with quiet precision that while Mr. Hartley had indeed confessed to administering poison to his employer, the physical evidence suggested that his confession, however emotionally authentic, was not entirely consistent with the facts of the case, and that the murder of Marcus Ashford, while possibly motivated by mercy in the valet's mind, had in fact been accomplished by someone with considerably more direct access to the victim and considerably more intimate knowledge of his habits and vulnerabilities than even a devoted servant of 40 years' standing could possess. The implication contained within Whimsy's observation hung suspended in the study's stale air, like a blade awaiting its descent, and Miss Catherine Ashford's face underwent a transformation so complete that she seemed momentarily to become a stranger to all those assembled. Her carefully maintained composure fractured with audible finality, and she rose from her chair with the abruptness of one propelled by forces entirely beyond her conscious control. Her voice, when she spoke, emerged in tones that bore no resemblance to the refined accent she had previously maintained, instead carrying the raw edge of desperation and profound anguish in equal measure. She declared that Whimsy had no right to interrogate her regarding matters of which he understood nothing, that he could not possibly comprehend the circumstances that had driven her to actions she would spend the remainder of her life regretting, and that whatever Hartley believed himself to have done, it was she who bore the true responsibility for her father's death. The confession emerged in a torrent of words, as though the dam that had held back years of accumulated guilt had finally fractured beneath the weight of Whimsy's subtle accusation. She revealed that she had discovered, quite by accident, the true extent of her father's financial catastrophe and the precise nature of the blackmail that had been applied against him. She had learned that Mr. Carrington, or rather Caldwell, intended to expose not merely her father's financial vulnerability, but also a secret that had been buried for 2 decades, a scandal involving her father's past that would have destroyed not only his reputation but the social standing and marriage prospects of his only child. It was this threat, Catherine explained, that had truly driven her father toward despair, not the financial ruin alone, but the prospect of his shame and his daughter's consequent social ostracism. Catherine's narrative proceeded with the careful precision of one recounting events she had rehearsed countless times in the privacy of her own conscience. She described how she had intercepted the threatening telegram the previous day, how she had read the newspaper accounts of Caldwell's criminal activities, and how she had understood with horrifying clarity that her father stood at the precipice of complete destruction. She had attempted to reason with him, to suggest that they flee to the continent, to propose solutions that seemed rational in the abstract but impossible in the context of her father's overwhelming shame and desperation. By the evening, when Caldwell had arrived at the house, she had recognized that her father had moved beyond the point of persuasion, that he had resigned himself to a fate worse than death, and that she faced a choice between permitting that fate to unfold or taking action herself. She confessed that it was she who had prepared the poisoned tea, using a substance obtained through connections she possessed among the household staff, and it was she who had ensured that her father would consume it. She had not, she insisted, intended to frame her father's death as suicide in order to shield herself from suspicion. Rather, she had hoped that the appearance of self-destruction would at least permit him to escape public knowledge of his involvement in fraudulent schemes, that his death could be attributed to the despair of a man of conscience overcome by guilt, rather than to the machinations of blackmailers and predatory criminals. She had not anticipated Caldwell's arrival during the crucial hours, had not known that the confrontation between her father and the blackmailer would occur after the poison had already been administered, and she had certainly not known that Frederick Hartley had conceived his own merciful plot to end her father's suffering. Whimsy listened to this confession with an expression of profound sadness rather than triumph, and when Catherine had concluded her narrative, he approached her not with the manner of an accuser, but with the gentle courtesy of one addressing a person in genuine distress. He observed that it seemed evident that she had acted from motives of love rather than malice, that her concern had been not for her own protection, but for her father's preservation from a degradation she had accurately perceived as worse than death itself. Yet he noted, with the quiet precision of a man stating obvious facts, that the administration of poison constituted murder regardless of the emotional circumstances that had prompted it, that the law made no provision for mercy killings however compassionately motivated, and that her confession would necessarily result in her facing trial for homicide. However, he continued, there were certain complicating factors that would require careful consideration during any subsequent proceedings. He pointed out that Frederick Hartley had also confessed to poisoning his employer, and that, while his confession appeared to be motivated by misplaced guilt rather than actual culpability, the existence of 2 confessions to the same crime would present considerable complications to any prosecutor attempting to establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Moreover, Whimsy suggested, there remained the question of James Caldwell's arrival in the study during the period when the poison had been taking effect, and the manner in which that arrival would be interpreted by a jury hearing the evidence. The psychological and emotional state of Marcus Ashford at the time of his death, the nature of the blackmail that had been applied against him, the threat to his daughter's future, all of these factors would necessarily inform the judgment of 12 ordinary citizens, attempting to determine whether the administration of poison constituted murder or something considerably more complex and considerably more morally ambiguous. Catherine Ashford sank back into her chair as though the weight of her own words had become physically unbearable, and Whimsy turned to address Constable Matthews and the assembled household with the measured tone of a man who has arrived at certain conclusions regarding the proper course of action. He suggested that the circumstances of Marcus Ashford's death were sufficiently complex and sufficiently fraught with moral and legal complications that the matter would require the careful attention of senior officials at Scotland Yard, and that he intended to dispatch a detailed report to that institution immediately. In the interim, he observed, he saw no necessity in immediately placing Miss Catherine Ashford under arrest, as she was unlikely to flee her father's estate, and the circumstances of the case seemed to demand considerably more careful examination before proceeding with formal charges. The relief that flooded across Catherine's features was tempered by the understanding that this respite represented merely a postponement of reckoning, rather than an escape from consequence, and as Whimsy concluded his statement, the study seemed to settle into a silence profoundly different from its earlier atmosphere. No longer the silence of mystery, but the silence of confession, of guilt acknowledged and fate accepted. The remainder of the afternoon at Ashford Hall proceeded with the peculiar temporal distortion that attends moments of profound revelation, the hours seeming simultaneously to stretch and compress as though time itself had lost its ordinary relationship to human experience. Whimsy withdrew to the library with the household records and correspondence, his demeanor suggesting a man who had temporarily placed the emotional dimensions of the case aside in favor of its more technical requirements, yet his eyes betrayed a thoughtfulness that suggested his mind was engaged in considerably more complex calculations than the mere documentation of facts. Constable Matthews, having transmitted the relevant telegrams to Scotland Yard, found himself relegated to the role of observer, a position he occupied with the self-conscious awareness of a man beginning to recognize the limits of his own intellectual capacity when confronted with circumstances of genuine complexity. Miss Catherine Ashford retreated to her room under the pretense of indisposition, though the sounds of her weeping could be heard distantly throughout the household, a reminder to all assembled that whatever legal complications might attend her confession, the emotional weight of her actions remained devastatingly immediate. Frederick Hartley returned to his duties with a mechanical precision that suggested his emotional resources had been entirely exhausted by his own confession, and the household staff moved through their routines with the careful quietness of people navigating territory they did not fully comprehend and could not predict. It was toward early evening, as the coastal darkness settled over Ashford Hall with particular completeness, that Whimsy emerged from the library and requested the presence of both Miss Catherine Ashford and Mr. Ashford Sr. in the study, along with Dr. Reeves and Constable Matthews. His demeanor had undergone a subtle alteration, his earlier pensiveness having given way to something approaching theatrical purposefulness, the quality of bearing that accompanied his rare moments of genuine moral engagement with the world around him. When all parties had assembled, Whimsy proceeded to display upon the study desk the accumulated evidence of his afternoon's research, letters, telegrams, financial records, and most significantly, a document that he had discovered concealed within a hollowed volume on Mr. Ashford's bookshelf, a document that appeared to be a personal journal detailing the deceased's state of mind during the months preceding his death. This journal, Whimsy explained, altered substantially the narrative that had been constructed through the morning's revelations. The entries revealed that Marcus Ashford had indeed become aware of his daughter's involvement in procuring the poison, that he had discovered her intentions through means he had not specified, and that rather than being a passive victim of her mercy-killing, he had actively participated in the arrangement of his own death. More significantly, the final entries in the journal suggested that Marcus Ashford had become aware of Caldwell's true identity and criminal history, and that he had conceived the idea of his own death as a mechanism through which both to protect his daughter from exposure and to eliminate himself as a source of leverage that Caldwell could employ for purposes of further blackmail and extortion. The journal entries suggested, in effect, that Marcus Ashford had transformed his daughter's act of mercy into an act of complicity, had essentially recruited her into his own carefully staged suicide, while ensuring that she would bear the moral weight of the deception. Whimsy's reading of these passages produced a visible alteration in Catherine Ashford's emotional state, her weeping intensifying into something approaching hysteria as she confronted the revelation that her father's death had not been the unplanned consequence of her own desperation, but rather a calculated manipulation in which she had become an unwitting instrument. Whimsy allowed this emotional display to proceed without interruption, his expression suggesting the comprehension of a man who understood that some forms of truth required the entire emotional spectrum in order to be properly absorbed. Once Catherine's initial shock had begun to subside into something approaching resigned devastation, Whimsy proceeded to address the assembled company with a clarity that suggested he had moved beyond the investigation of facts into the territory of moral philosophy and psychological complexity. He observed that the case of Marcus Ashford's death presented considerable difficulty to those responsible for determining culpability and assigning punishment, because the circumstances suggested not one murder, but rather a collaboration in self-destruction that implicated multiple parties and multiple motivations in ways that defied the ordinary categories of law. He noted that Catherine Ashford had certainly administered poison to her father with the intent to cause his death, yet her motivation had been compassion rather than malice, and her father had actively collaborated in his own demise. Frederick Hartley had also confessed to administering poison with lethal intent, yet his confession appeared to be motivated by misplaced guilt rather than actual culpability, and his supposed act of mercy had occurred, in actuality, after the actual poisoning had already been accomplished. James Caldwell had arrived at the scene to discover his victim already deceased, had panicked and had fled, leaving behind only the rain hat and a set of circumstances that had initially appeared to incriminate him entirely. The complexity of these overlapping culpabilities and motivations seemed to fascinate Whimsy, engaging his intellect in the precise manner that such legal and moral tangles were calculated to do. Yet his face bore an expression of genuine sadness, rather than satisfaction, as he contemplated the human consequences of his OWN investigations. Whimsy turned his attention specifically toward the matter of James Caldwell, observing that while the blackmailer's presence in the household remained a crucial element of the morning's events, the physical evidence suggested that Caldwell had not perpetrated the actual murder. However, Whimsy continued, Caldwell's predatory actions had created the circumstances that had rendered Marcus Ashford sufficiently desperate to welcome his own destruction, and his criminal activities had directly precipitated the chain of events that had culminated in death. In the eyes of the law, such indirect causation might constitute murder through the application of pressure sufficient to render a victim suicidal, though prosecuting such a charge would require evidence and witnesses to Caldwell's explicit threats that seemed unlikely to materialize. Therefore, Whimsy suggested, the question that remained was not merely who had physically administered the poison, but rather who bore moral and legal responsibility for the death that had resulted from the complex interplay of desperation, compassion, and calculated manipulation that had characterized the events of the preceding hours. The tension that had accumulated within the study throughout Whimsy's exposition seemed to press against the very walls, and it was Dr. Reeves who ventured the hesitant inquiry that hung unspoken in the minds of all assembled, whether Lord Whimsy's discourse on moral and legal complexity represented merely theoretical speculation, or whether it contained within it some indication of the course of action he intended to recommend to the authorities at Scotland Yard. Whimsy regarded the physician with an expression suggesting appreciation for the directness of the question, and he proceeded to explain that the matter before them presented certain peculiarities that seemed to warrant considerate beyond the ordinary categories of criminal investigation. He noted that Marcus Ashford had been a man of considerable social standing, whose financial misadventures had been occasioned not by moral turpitude but by the criminal deceptions of predatory individuals who had deliberately targeted him for exploitation. He observed that Catherine Ashford had acted from motives of familial love and protection, and that her involvement in her father's death, while undoubtedly constituting a technical violation of law, had been undertaken with the full knowledge and complicity of her father himself, who had actively sought her participation in order to accomplish a purpose he had already resolved upon. He suggested, moreover, that the appearance of Frederick Hartley's parallel confession had created circumstances of such genuine ambiguity regarding who had actually administered the fatal dose that any prosecution would face considerable evidentiary complications, particularly given that the valet's emotional state at the time of confession had rendered his account of events considerably less reliable than one might ordinarily expect. The synthesis of these observations seemed to point towards certain conclusions regarding the proper course of action, yet Wimsey refrained from stating those conclusions explicitly, instead allowing them to emerge gradually from the logical structure he had constructed. It was at this juncture that a knock upon the study door interrupted the proceedings, and a telegraph was delivered indicating that Scotland Yard had apprehended James Caldwell, or rather James Caldwell's alias, attempting to board a packet vessel bound for Calais at the port of Newhaven. The arrest had been accomplished through the coordinated efforts of the constabulary and the immigration authorities, who had recognized Caldwell from the description provided by Wimsey's early. Our telegrams. Scotland Yard indicated that Caldwell was being held pending interrogation regarding his involvement in the fraudulent schemes that had victimized Marcus Ashford and numerous other individuals, and that his apprehension would likely result in charges considerably more serious than those that would ordinarily attach to mere blackmail. The arrival of this intelligence seemed to crystallize something in Wimsey's mind, and he turned to address the assembled company with a tone suggesting that his investigations had arrived at a natural conclusion. He declared that it appeared the time had come for him to dispatch a comprehensive report to Scotland Yard, detailing his findings regarding the death of Marcus Ashford, and moreover to offer certain recommendations regarding the manner in which the various culpabilities and responsibilities might most appropriately be addressed within the framework of the law and the demands of natural justice. However, before doing so, he indicated, he wished to undertake one final investigation, a matter that had troubled him since his initial examination of the study's physical arrangements, and which he believed required clarification through direct observation and experimentation. Wimsey's announcement that he intended to conduct a reconstruction of the events of the morning occasioned considerable surprise among those assembled, and he proceeded to outline with meticulous precision the manner in which he wished the participants in the morning's events to position themselves and reenact their movements. He instructed Frederick Hartley to bring the tea service to the study at precisely the hour at which he had delivered it that morning, and he directed Sarah Thorne to return to the study at the time she had brought the poisoned tea, retracing her steps and her movements with exactitude. He requested that Constable Matthews observe the precise duration of time that elapsed during various stages of the reenactment, and he positioned himself at the study window with instruments that suggested he intended to measure certain spatial relationships and temporal intervals with considerable precision. The participants in this theatrical reconstruction proceeded with the self-conscious awareness of people engaged in an unusual enterprise, and as the events of the morning were replayed in their essential outlines, Wimsey observed with absorbed concentration, occasionally requesting that certain movements be repeated or that certain intervals be timed with greater precision. By the conclusion of the reenactment, Wimsey appeared to have confirmed whatever hypothesis he had been testing, and he dismissed the participants with instructions to await his further communications regarding the resolution of the matter. As evening deepened toward night, Wimsey settled himself once more at the study desk and composed a lengthy telegram to Scotland Yard, detailing his findings and offering his professional assessment of the circumstances that had attended Marcus Ashford's death. The precise content of this communication remained known only to Wimsey himself, though his expression as he composed it suggested a man wrestling with genuine moral complexity rather than engaging in the straightforward application of law to facts. When he had completed his composition and entrusted it to Constable Matthews for transmission, he withdrew to the library, and did not emerge again until the following morning, at which point his demeanor suggested a man who had spent the night in contemplation of matters extending considerably beyond the immediate circumstances of the case at hand. The household settled into an uneasy repose, all aware that the investigation had reached some form of conclusion, yet uncertain regarding the nature. of that conclusion, or its implications for those whose actions had precipitated the death of Marcus Ashford. The morning brought with it a telegram from Scotland Yard that seemed to settle the matter with a finality that surprised no one who had been attending closely to Wimsey's methodical dissection of the facts. The communication indicated that following consultation with senior prosecutors and after careful consideration of the evidentiary complexities attending the case, the Crown had determined that the prosecution of Miss Catherine Ashford for the death of her father would not be pursued. Given the extraordinary circumstances of the deceased's own complicity in his demise, and the profound ambiguities regarding culpability that attended the administration of poison by multiple parties with divergent motivations. However, the telegram continued, charges would be brought against James Caldwell, the man operating under various aliases for fraud, blackmail, and conspiracy to extort, crimes for which the evidence was considerably more straightforward and for which prosecution could proceed without the moral and legal complications that had attended any attempt to bring charges related to Marcus Ashford's death. The communication further indicated that Scotland Yard had forwarded commendations to both Wimsey and Constable Matthews for their exemplary investigative work, though the nature of Wimsey's role in arriving at the recommendations regarding prosecution remained, characteristically, somewhat obscure. Frederick Hartley, the telegram noted, would not be prosecuted for his false confession, as he had been motivated by misplaced guilt rather than complicity in actual crime, and his advanced age and unblemished service record had been taken into consideration by the Crown in determining that the interests of justice would not be served by subjecting him to trial. The resolution appeared, on its surface, to constitute a triumph of pragmatism over rigid legalism, a recognition that certain situations defied easy categorization within the binary framework of guilt and innocence that ordinarily governed the criminal law. Yet Wimsey received this communication with an expression suggesting that the matter remained, in his estimation, considerably more complex than the Crown's pragmatic disposition of charges and countercharges might indicate. He summoned Catherine Ashford to the study one final time, and when she appeared, pale and worn by the emotional exertions of the preceding days, he addressed her with a gravity that suggested he was not content to allow the official resolution to constitute the final word on the matter. He explained to her, with the careful precision of a man choosing his words with particular attention to their implications, that while she would not be prosecuted in the courts of law, she would necessarily remain subject to a tribunal considerably more demanding and considerably less merciful, the tribunal of her own conscience, and the judgment of history regarding the moral dimensions of her actions. He observed that the administration of poison to another human being, regardless of the emotional circumstances that had prompted it or the victim's subsequent complicity in his own death, constituted an act that would permanently alter the trajectory of her existence and would impose upon her responsibilities that transcended the legal framework entirely. He suggested, moreover, that the apparent resolution of the case should not be mistaken for genuine closure, as the psychological and moral consequences of matricide, or rather of filicide accomplished through poisoning, would likely persist throughout the remainder of her life, coloring her relationships, her decisions, and her understanding of herself in ways that no legal acquittal could alter or diminish. Catherine Ashford received this discourse with the peculiar attentiveness of one hearing truths she had already internalized but required external validation to fully acknowledge, and tears streamed down her face as Wimsey completed his observations. He proceeded to suggest, with the gentle authority that had characterized his handling of the case from its inception, that she might benefit considerably from removing herself from Ashford Hall for an extended period, that the associations of the household with her father's death would likely prove psychologically damaging if permitted to persist, and that a period of travel or residence abroad might provide the distance necessary to begin processing the extraordinary events that had transpired. He further suggested that she might consider employing her considerable intelligence and education in some productive capacity, that the channeling of her emotional and intellectual resources into purposes beyond mere survival might constitute a form of redemption that, while not erasing the moral weight of her actions, might at least render them bearable. Catherine departed from the study with the appearance of one who had received both condemnation and absolution in equal measure, and Wimsey turned his attention to the matter of departure itself, indicating to Constable Matthews that he believed his investigative work at Ashford Hall had reached its conclusion, and that he intended to return to London that afternoon. Before departing, however, Wimsey took the rain hat from where it had remained, positioned upon the study chair throughout the investigation, and examined it one final time with the concentration of a man reading meaning from inanimate objects. He turned it over in his hands, observing the maker's mark, the careful tailoring, and the particular quality of wear that suggested a garment that had been valued and preserved. He remarked to the assembled household that the rain hat had proved, in its modest fashion, to be the crucial element that had illuminated the entire mystery, not through any inherent quality of the object itself, but rather through the manner in which its presence and abandonment had contradicted the narrative that the crime scene's theatrical arrangement had been calculated to suggest. An innocent man fleeing in panic abandons such objects. A guilty man perpetrating a carefully staged suicide does not. The hat had whispered its testimony through the medium of its very insignificance, and Wimsey proceeded to return it to its place with the reverential care one might reserve for an artifact of historical importance. As he made his final exit from Ashford Hall, traversing the entrance hall where the household staff had assembled to bid farewell to their unexpected guest, Wimsey paused and remarked, with the characteristic irony that had attended his observations throughout the investigation, that he found himself grateful for the opportunity to have encountered a mystery of sufficient complexity to merit his attention, and that he hoped the household would find, in time, whatever measure of peace remained, available to those who had lived through the particular species of tragedy that had unfolded within the walls of their home. He departed into the November afternoon with the insouciance of a man for whom such encounters constituted merely the routine business of existence, leaving behind a household forever altered by the revelations he had precipitated and the truths he had methodically exposed to the light of reason and logic.